And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, this is Drew Perkins, and welcome back to the Teach Thought Podcast. I am your host, and I'm also the Director of Teach Thought Professional Development. As always, I'd like to invite you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to check out our professional development services. All of our work is focused through the lens of inquiry, and project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and inquiry are the mainstays of the work that we do, but there you'll find some other pieces of work that we also engage in and help schools with. On the matter of project-based learning, I'm excited to let you know that registration is indeed open for our PBL Grow 23 event that has been on hiatus for a couple of years due to COVID. We'll be hosting that in our home base of Louisville, Kentucky, June 26th through 28th at a very cool venue. And we've just recently added a new keynote speaker that I think will be interesting. That event is meant to be an open registration workshop for individuals and small groups who are interested in learning more about project-based learning. So we use our Foundations of PBL workshop to help you understand and create a project for implementation with your classroom. School leaders, of course, would be creating a project that would be related to their work as school leaders. You can find more information about that at wegrowteachers.com/grow23. As always, we appreciate any shares, likes, reviews, and those kinds of things with regards to the podcast. It helps us build our audience and hopefully helps teachers and educators around the world better prepare students for the modern world. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Tabia Lee, who is an educational sociologist and researcher and has been working in the education space for quite some time. She's also one of the co-founders of a project called Free Black Thought, and that is where she posted and published an article that we used as the center of our conversation here called Race Ideology in Practice, Racial Equity in American Learning Environments. We spent some time early kind of unpacking her background and who she is and what Free Black Thought is, and then dived into some of the concepts that she discussed in the piece, most specifically unpacking the different kinds of more common race ideologies and how they might differ from the prevailing one, which she would say is neo-reconstructionist. You might recognize that as ones being associated with anti-racist education as advocated for by the likes of Ibram X. Kendi. And we talked about the ways in which other race ideologies and thinking around race and racism might be useful to educators to know about, to think about, and the ways in which those kinds of different ideologies and ways of thinking are not often welcome in the spaces of current anti-racist education. She has some personal experience with this, and she talked a bit about that, and we tried to unpack some of the complexities, but certainly not all of it, because it is a very complex and, I think, important topic to unpack. With that said, as always, I hope this conversation is helpful. Well, Lee, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you. As usual, I want to give an opportunity to say hello to those folks who are listening and to introduce yourself so they know who the heck they are listening to. So now's your chance.
Awesome. I'm Dr. Tabia Lee. I'm out here in sunny California, in Sacramento to be precise. And I'm a lifelong educator. Teaching is my vocation. I've been teaching as long as I've been learning, and I'm just thrilled to have an opportunity to speak with you, Drew, to kind of talk about, my most recent article on race ideology and practice. That is a concept that I've developed over many years of working with teachers and really wanting to help teachers to better understand the different ideologies that underlie those personal and professional knowledge and experiences that they bring to the classroom and that are expressed and embodied and enacted in classroom spaces. whether it's from, how teachers interact with communities, with students, with parents, with the world at large. It's really been something, part of my life work, really, to help build better understanding about ideology and practice of various kinds.
Right. So we're gonna talk about several things, but one of those things is certainly the article that you referred to from February 28th on free black thought, and we'll probably need to expand on what the heck that is, because some people may not know that, in the Journal of Free Black Thought. But before we do, what is you said you have an education background. What are some of the positions you've held, and kind of give us a little bit of a chronicle so folks have that background as well, if you don't mind.
Awesome. Yes, I would love to. So I started off in education as a gifted and talented education student. And at that time, they didn't really kind of know what to do with us. So I spent a lot of time playing Oregon Trail and being utilized as a peer tutor in my elementary school. And so when people ask, when did you start teaching? I say, I started teaching when I was an elementary school student because it was literally that soon. And then I also had, if folks can remember these platforms, CompuServe and AOL and local BBSs. I had like little ed groups on there as a teenager.
We're dating ourselves.
Yes, yes. One of my first jobs, like my first real jobs, was as a technical support rep for a dial-up service provider. So I've been involved, Drew, with like online teaching, if you will, since it started. So it's not something I jumped into during the pandemic. It was something that I was always involved in and passionate about, in like building online communities and so forth. And then I went and got my bachelor's, and I decided to move from the Central Valley where I grew up. I grew up born in Stockton, raised in Lodi. I moved to Los Angeles to begin a teacher education program there. And so I went through their beginning teacher support program, and I began teaching in Los Angeles. Specifically, after my first year of teaching, I had a 1 year where I taught severely emotionally disturbed children who had been removed from their homes for abuse and neglect. That was my first teaching assignment with Los Angeles Unified as a first year. And then I moved on to teaching at a middle school in East Los Angeles, and I taught there for nearly 10 years, gifted English language learners, civics, social studies, and English. And during that time, I became a national board certified English teacher, and then I also became a national board certified social studies teacher. And then I started a network for minoritized teachers to achieve national board certification, because at that time the numbers were very low in terms of representation of minoritized teachers successfully achieving national board certification. And I helped teachers at that time in LAUSD to navigate from the paper grade books to electronic grade books. So I've helped folks navigate technology change and integrate technology like from the beginning. And also really focusing on English language learners and helping teachers to understand that giftedness is a neurodiversity and not something that was tied to language. So this was during the time of English only in California. And some folks believed that if you didn't speak English, you couldn't be gifted. And so I did a lot of education around that, and that it's translingual, and the different, social and emotional supports and academic supports that gifted children, really thrive when they have access to. And in terms of civic education, that's something I've always been passionate about. So my students are doing things like voter registration drives. We were holding model UN panels. We had community panels, UN meaning United Nations. We also did things like philosophical chairs, Socratic seminars, all kinds of really awesome experiences and some insightful. I would always say that my middle school students were often more insightful, engaging, and informed than the adults who were coming to our events that we held. Just amazing children to work with. And so then after doing that for some time, I decided, hey, I want to make a bigger impact. And so I decided, let's shift to higher ed after I got my doctorate in education, in educational leadership and administration, actually. And so after traveling outside of the US for a bit, I switched over to higher ed. The job search wasn't as I thought it would go. I thought there would be these jobs like raining down, but that's not what happened. So I ended up part-time teaching for many years, Drew. The only folks who would hire me were Catholic universities, private Catholic universities. And that was based on a commitment to social justice, which is now a buzzword and a word that means so many different things. But they welcomed me into their space. And unfortunately, though, could never give me a full-time position. So I part-timed and kept chasing the carrot for so long. And then after many years of that with multiple institutions in that realm, I said, I really want to get back to public education because that's where my heart is. As a middle schooler, I was taking classes at my local community college. And I had to get special approval. Nowadays it's common, but I had to have approval from the principal and from the counselors at the college and my parents. And I ended up graduating from high school early as a result of all the credits that I accumulated from starting in middle school, and being able to accelerate through. So I said, I want to go back, and I want to give back to community colleges. And so a silver lining of the pandemic for me was, in addition to my educational consultancy, which I have, where I've mostly done just knowledge generation and presented at conferences and so forth and like written articles, I was able to land a position in a California community college. It was a temporary position though. But it was my first faculty position as an instructional designer college-wide at one of the community colleges in Silicon Valley. But when that temporary assignment ended, I was like, it was so sweet, but so brief, that temporary 1-year contract. So I ended up doing that job search again and putting out apps again, and then landed a position as a faculty director for an Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education. And that again allowed me to come full circle with, kind of my life works, wanting to support teachers, wanting to have an impact on teacher education, and to serve the public as well as a public school educator. So that's where I find myself now. Still have my consultancy. It is mostly knowledge generation, but I did get some clients, of like schools and districts and individuals during the pandemic. But that's kind of where things have landed for me as things are going, as things are now.
And what was I'm assuming since you have an EdD, what was your research topic?
So my research topic for my doctoral dissertation was on the human fallout, educators' perspectives about No Child Left Behind implementation in urban schools. And so it was a qualitative research project. And I really wanted to elevate the teacher voice and lived experience of what was it like to work under No Child Left Behind implementation, because at that time it was really rolling out into schools. In my master's, I looked at Latino civic competency and the importance of that for California and California's future. And as we see how the demographics have shifted since that time, that was also something that was, I'm always looking in the environment and I'm seeing what's around us and how is it impacting teachers. And so both pieces, both my master's and my doctorate, was really trying to elevate and take a look at, what are some policies that are being enacted and how do they impact lived experiences of teachers and getting teacher voice out into the discussion, because policymakers often, and now even more so today, aren't speaking to teachers who are on the ground and in the trenches.
No, I would say I can't disagree with that. They're certainly speaking about them. That I think we would both agree on. And just to sort of maybe fill in any of the gaps, I'm sometimes curious and ask this question, like, what was your childhood and upbringing like, outside of some of the things you expressed already, and, your parents and what kind of work did they do, and sort of some of those underlying factors.
Yes, actually, a lot of my experiences in elementary school. So I talked about the positive side of it.
Yeah.
But there were some negative experiences that I had with teasing and bullying, actually, that have affected the trajectory of my life of teaching in general, because some of the students I tutored were thankful and had gratitude, and they were like, "That's wonderful." But others actually teased and bullied me. I mean, like on a mass scale. And I would go to my teachers and even my parents, and they would just say, "It's part of life. Everybody gets bullied." And I don't think that folks realize the scope of it, and how ostracized, I was. And so I made a commitment to never having a student in my learning environment, feel as though they were ostracized or not heard, or that if they've complained, about someone bullying or teasing them, that it will be ignored. And so I was highly committed to that, and have been in my teacher trainings that I do, in my classroom environments that I facilitate. I really do focus a lot on inclusion. And by that, I mean something different than what's in the mainstream media and what folks talk about. I mean like authentic acceptance of every person in the space for who they are and where they are at that time. And that's kind of interesting because it's bled over into my work in this area of DEI, or as people call it, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I see, Drew, a lot of non-acceptance of others, and a lot of shutting down and canceling of teachers who don't express absolute fidelity and alignment with whatever the dominant ideology is in their sphere. And that deeply concerns me, because now, right, we're not just talking about kids in the classroom being bullied, but sometimes teachers are being bullied and literally shut out of the profession. And I see a lack of ideological diversity, a lack of people being able to really do why I came into this work. I wanted to get my doctorate and become a professor, if you will, so that I could contribute to the field, so that I could speak my truth in my mind and what I see happening around me without fear. And what I see right now is there's a lot of fear, a lot of self-censoring among teachers. There's folks who don't want to say anything because we feel like, I'll be accused of being a racist, or, in a moment I could be accused of being homophobic, or, transphobic, or whatever it may be, these isms and so forth. The accusations that fly so quickly right now deeply concern me. And it goes back to that childhood experience of bullying and teasing, and me, and the child inside of me saying, wow, this is happening again. And these are not kids, these are adults. And what are the impacts for society at large when we can't engage with conflict in effective ways, when we can't engage with diverse perspectives or divergent perspectives, in civil ways? And so it's kind of strange to me how things have kind of come full circle. And as I mentioned before, depending on your parents and who's around you as your support, they may just say that's part of life and power through, that's kind of their approach. But for me, I've always had this ability to empathize with others, and to want everyone to feel like they can be seen and heard. And that comes into my work as a DEI specialist, if you will, because I cannot just advance one ideology. I'm always bringing multiple things in and working with adult learners and saying, hey, take a look at all of these different things and what resonates with you, and telling people, hey, this can change over time, our context, and that's okay. And it's okay for us to be different and to have different thinking and ways of thinking from each other. That's part of what makes life beautiful. That seems like commonplace to me, but in today's world, unfortunately, it's like I'm saying something that's new, or in some places like sacrilege, where certain ideologies are in operation and dominating things.
Right. Well, one more maybe sort of foundational question is, so you're one of the co-founders of Free Black Thought, and this is where the article is sort of housed online, that we're going to talk about race ideology in practice. How did that happen? And for listeners who are not familiar with Free Black Thought, FBT, what is that all about?
Yes. So Free Black Thought, and our president is Eric Smith, Dr. Eric Smith. So I'm not representing them in this podcast.
And Eric's been on the podcast.
Yes, yeah, I'm just representing myself. I always like to say that because, sometimes when you're on a board and then you make statements, folks may be like, oh, the board member said X, Y. So right. I'm just speaking as an individual. But what Free Black Thought is doing is elevating heterodox Black voices, voices that aren't part of the mainstream, that are excluded from the mainstream often, that don't get the mainstream airplay because they don't maybe go along with the dominant narratives that are being pushed about Blackness and what it means to be Black in today's society. So it's a space, we're a multiracial group, and we're really just elevating heterodox Black voices. And so how does that connect to this work? Well, really, for me, this whole, as I mentioned, in the early 2000s, I started working with my research partner at that time, Cinzia Forsepi, on better understanding the research around ideology in teacher education journals, in teacher journals, in education journals. And we wanted to see how is ideology mentioned, in what format. And from that's where this concept grew from, of teacher ideology in practice. And that's where, my work began, with doing workshops and doing PDs and trainings with teachers to raise that conscious awareness about the fact that we are really expressing and embodying and enacting a wide variety of ideologies, whether they're racial, religious, gender, political, name the topic, right? There's ideologies or frameworks of thinking that are rooted in teachers' personal and professional experiences. And raising awareness about that helps us to identify, how are we interacting with colleagues, with the curriculum, with students, with the world at large. How are those ideologies impacting that? And why is that so important for us to understand as we work with each other? And, we're able to identify these different ideologies and name them. I think that that's a powerful thing and a tool to have to better understand folks. Because right now, especially around race, I was so thankful to get exposed to Dr. Sheena Mason's work. I had never before Dr. Sheena Mason heard of philosophies of race. Okay, and you're talking to someone who is deeply involved in teacher education, reading voraciously, wanting to make positive changes in that. And it's just funny to me that I accepted many things as fact because literally, Drew, they were taught to me by my mentors. I told you I'm an educational sociologist, right? So, and it was like, yeah, okay, race is socially constructed. Yep. And I didn't question them. So when I encountered Dr. Sheena Mason's work, it caused a lot of cognitive dissonance, if you will, for me. Because I was like, wait a minute, what? There's different ways to view this. And no one's ever told me that. And I thought I was pretty, well-read and, staying on top of the latest thing. I try to do that. And it's like, not a single teacher ever told me there's different ways to view race. It was always just, here it is. This is what it is. And this is how it works. And I never questioned it myself. And so as I grappled with that, and it was tough, encountering my own mindset, my own frameworks, through Dr. Mason's work, and seeing hey, I just uncritically accepted things and never questioned them. Because I just thought that's the way reality was. That's what I was taught in my teacher education programs. None of those folks ever said, hey, we're working from this perspective when we're telling you this, that race is real or so forth. So once I discovered that, it was like the Pandora's box. It was open. And so I'm like, wow, I cannot in good faith, because I'm a public servant and a public teacher, school teacher, I have to share what I've learned with others so that they can name what's happening around us. Because it's been full force since about 2000s after the social events that took place. This whole concept of racial equity, and everyone started talking about it. And then when I would go to different organizations, different people meant different things by it. And so before Dr. Sheena Mason's work and getting exposed and then diving deep into all these philosophers and folks who've been doing that, right? It's a whole area of study. I was like, wow, we have to start talking about this and naming it in education spaces, because folks are making equity policies and, equity this and that, but what's meant by equity is something different to me, to the next person, and even to the person who wrote the policy. So, and how is that affecting students and student learning, to have all these different definitions and to have some that are obviously being skewed and guided by a particular ideology that no one's uncovering and unmasking and stating aloud. So for me, that was something that became a duty for me to raise awareness that there's many ways to approach this. If you're in an environment where folks are acting like, it is what it is and don't question it, then that should be even more concerning for folks, because what are the ideologies? What do they mean? And what are the outcomes, like on a societal scale, of embracing certain ideologies over others, are over pretending that there's only one way to do DEI work when there's many ways to do it and many different tools, and starting to look more critically at these pedagogical concepts and tools that are being enacted in classrooms that are rooted in these various ideologies. The importance of that, because again, some of my favorite tools that I was using for years, I said, oh, wow, this is rooted in something that actually doesn't square well with who I am today and what I would like to see for society. And that was a tough one. That was a tough one.
Well, we both share and admire Sheena and her work, and just if folks want to learn more about that, definitely check her out. But she was on the podcast back in December of 21, so that's episode 276, Transcending Racism with the Theory of Racelessness. And so with all of that sort of foundational piece, all those pieces hopefully under us to sort of undergird this conversation, the piece that you've written is, again, called Race, Ideology, and Practice. We'll put it in the show notes, but you can find it on Free Black Thought, which is, I think you all have a website, but you also have Substack, which is where this came out, freeblackthought.substack.com. Again, we'll put it in the show notes and all of that. But one of the things that you try to do here is to outline the most common race ideologies. And again, like you, when I sort of first heard it and was exposed to Sheena's work and the ways in which it can be thought of differently, it was really sort of like, I had never thought about that. And to your point, we just sort of have been working, I think, in most cases with a set of assumptions and hadn't really been forced to or even been allowed to kind of dive into different ways to think about it. And so, using, I do think it's really useful, and hopefully educators are listening. It's like, what are the assumptions that they might have about what race is, what race means, what the word racist means, what racism means, and you do some work in there, and again, you're building on Sheena's work. So racism which has the ism in parentheses, and then racialist, which is a term that you and I both use and talk about, somebody being racialized as this identity, that identity, this race, that race, all of those kinds of things. I mean, maybe we can start with the elevator pitch kind of unpacking of these most common race ideologies so that teachers, educators, anybody who's listening can get a better idea of what you're talking about. Because if they're not aware of it, they're probably thinking, what in the heck are they even talking about?
Yes. So, and I say this in the paper too, because this essay, it really only explores 4, but there are so many race philosophies or what I call race ideologies out there, Drew. So I want to say that up front, because, sometimes people read it and they say like, but what about this author? And you didn't include that author. I mean, it's a vast field.
Right.
So what I was really trying to do was to give like people who are new to this and people who are more experienced with it, just kind of an overview of just the four most common ones. So I delved into naturalism. And this is like the early European conceptions, right, of race, that it's just natural, that, racial division is natural part of human existence. Nothing should be done to fix it because it's just here. So that's what a more naturalist approach would say. And when I think back to my early education experiences, a lot of the teaching I encountered in elementary school and so forth was more based in a naturalist understanding of things. Maybe it's the context or the geographical or political context that I was in the Central Valley, but that's just what I encountered. And then moving on into now, something that I'm coining as neo-reconstructionism. So because it's a very specific kind of remaking of race and racism that we're seeing through, authors like Joy DeGruy, Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi. And these are the ones that are really being held up in so many spaces like our California community colleges, unfortunately. Have embraced it, but not named that that's what they're doing when they speak of anti-racist and anti-racist approaches. So that's really talking about racial division being baked into American life, that a race is a social construction and a political construction of white people made to serve the interests of white people. That's that strain of thought that we see in so many places now. And then I also speak on constructionism, and provide some of the representative authors too. I provide a really extensive reference list that I encourage people to kind of take a look at if you want to unpack some of these things. But that's this idea that race is socially constructed. A constructivist eliminativist would say that race is socially constructed and it must be eliminated. So, because some people say like, I'm with you, it needs to be eliminated, but I still feel that it's socially constructed. So that's that kind of position. I didn't delve into it, but I did put a note because that's a significant, again, emergent perspective that we don't hear a lot about. We mostly just hear that it's socially constructed and it's baked into life and we can never escape it and so forth through the neo-reconstructionist lens. And then the skeptical eliminativist, that would be like Dr. Mason, Dr. Carlos Hoyt as well. And that's putting forth these the propositions that, race isn't existing in nature. It doesn't exist as a social construction. They would argue that everyone's raceless, that race was created to justify racism, and that, it's not real. It must cease to matter. It's not a legitimate foundation of identity. And that it's a habit of mind, racialization and the practice of it. Carlos Hoyt, I really appreciate his work. He says it's a habit of mind that can be broken. And his work really delves into that, unpacking that for people. So, I've had other people comment on the article and say, what about Greg Thomas and this person and that person? I'm like, yes, there's many others, We wanted to have the tables be compact, and just give some of the highlights, but there are many others working on this. On these topics, and we're hoping that as people start to tap into it, the work of folks who've been doing this work and unpacking it can really be shared, because why in our teacher education programs and in our professional development programs are these things not being discussed and talked about, but yet there are specialists popping into schools and so forth, and they're definitely working oftentimes from a particular ideology, but not telling people that. And then people think they've sat with the expert, right, on DEI. They came to us, and we now know that we must act in this way because that expert told us that it's baked in, and we've got to just, take significant action and endless work that will never end, so that we can, make it right. And so we're acting on it and doing things around it, but we're not pushing back and questioning enough, unfortunately, at this time and saying like, well, what is that perspective from? Are there other ways to view this? No one's asking that because there's environments that are created of if you speak up and ask a question, you may become a target. And folks may think certain things about you. And that's concerning for democracy, for the craft of teaching. for teachers' ability to do what's best for students and things that align with each of us and our individual teaching philosophies.
Right, right.
We're not a mass. We're all individuals, and we have different experiences that we're coming to this work with. And so that's where I come in with my work I do, just helping people to see, and to look around us and to accept each other, because we have to do that and identify our common ground, even with these different philosophies, if we really want to make the world a better place for the students that we are supposed to be serving.
Right. So we have naturalism, neo-reconstructionism, constructionism, and then skeptical eliminativism. And the neo-reconstructionism, as the name might hint at, is fairly new. And the constructionism, and I do think it's important, as you noted, to sort of distinguish between the way that we think about race and what we think should happen going forward. And that to me is one of the questions that I struggle with. I mean, I loved the book Racecraft by the Field Sisters, and while they, as you had said, they're constructionist and recognizing and allowing that it is a social construct, or at least it operates as one, because we have for years been just sort of operating as though there are black people, there are white people, there are other quote unquote races, when in fact that is scientifically and biologically not true. And so they would say, that the Field Sisters would say, we're playing a game called Racecraft. And again, I really think that is a wonderful book for folks to read. And there's a couple of videos out there where I think it's Barbara, who I think Karen must be a recluse compared to Barbara, and Barbara isn't out there a whole lot, but there's one really good one with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and then I think there's another one that I think is out there that is also pretty interesting. But one of the questions that I do wrestle with, and I love to think in inquiry, I think you probably do in many ways as well, is like, so not, trying to find that complexity. And so how do we recognize and think about race as a social construct as it has operated historically, and recognize that there are obvious events of racism and the ways in which it has manifested has had some catastrophic and diabolical outcomes and all of that, right? And so how do we rectify that wrong, as sort of a Kendi would say we have to do and we must do, while also looking to the forward, to the future, and with the goal that we are, as Carlos would say, sort of changing that habit of mind, that we are not using any concept of race when we're viewing other individuals and other humans, because, as you mentioned, we are all individuals, but we also share a common humanity. And in any of the work that we do that even edges into this sort of DEI space, and we do some SEL work, and it's like, I always want to make sure we might find some real value, and I think there is some real value in, let's say, students sort of thinking about their identity. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, although there are some people who would look at that and go, this is CRT going wild, or, some version of that. But I also want to make sure that we are, at the sort of same time, or as part of that process, we're leaning back into and recognizing, what do you and I and all of us share in common? And there is just one race. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you think about that sort of recognizing what's happened in the past and has brought us here, and then looking at the future, as Carlos and Sheena would say, we don't have any concept of race, like it has gone away, that kind of thing.
Yes, you touched on a lot of things there, Drew. So let me.
That's my specialty.
let me try to unpack it from. So for me personally, I don't identify as any of these different categories. And I've been asked that when I've done workshops around, unpacking these ideologies of race. The first thing people want to know is, which one do you identify with? And I'm like, none of the above, some of the above. It's kind of that way with me, because as a teacher and facilitator, I think that when we have a particular thing that we're trying to push, it can limit the ability of our learners and our participants to be able to fully state how they feel, and what's true for them, because then they start to align with what the quote expert in the room is saying. And so I think one of the most concerning things that I have is kind of similar to what you said. When we're talking about race, we can all like disagree, but then racism, that concept, the fact that, a naturalist would say like, it's just something that we have to deal with because, it's the law of the land or the jungle or however you will. But neo-reconstructionists really have a different understanding of racism. And it's not one that we've ever had or held in American society. And the changes that they're making through policy, through definitions, even when you look online to see what is racism, having, library and dictionary definitions rewritten to align with neo-reconstructionist thought, it's a deep concern because it's talking about racism being the cause of everything that happens in life, that it's systemic and ever present. It can't be overcome. It really targets white people, and it's the neo-reconstructionist lens. It states that only whites can be racist because they have collective social and institutional power and privilege over what is known as people of color, which is, again, a problematic phrase and term. And it ignores individual instances of racism and racist expression, that we've commonly known and seen, and, that Dr. Martin Luther King and others spoke about. And it really puts forth this idea that, it's okay to discriminate now because things that have happened in the past. The present discrimination is a remedy for past discrimination.
Right, that's a candy, yeah.
Yes. So, it's redefining what is racism. And that's dangerous in many ways because it does present the history of the nation. Everything is viewed through this lens of systemic racism, if you will. And that's why you see sometimes even constructionists, kind of disagreeing with the neo-reconstructionists, because they're like, yes, we're with you. It's socially constructed and so forth, but only whites can be racist. No, I've had some personal experiences, that make that fly, out the window. And so this redefinition of racism, it's very pernicious. It's very problematic, the way that it's being redefined and enacted in policy as a result. And so that's where I think that this skeptical eliminativism has such great promise, for helping us move past this moment where we're getting trapped into division, into demonizing one group of people, into, retribution, instead of like more generative forms of interaction with one another. And I think it's problematic because, like you mentioned earlier, some politicians attacking CRT and so forth, many times if they would even become more clear about these philosophies or ideologies of race, that would be helpful because then we can see, where that's aligning with and why it's so problematic, when we try to make groups of people into eternal victims or oppressors. And when we put lenses on human experience, categories that people must ascribe to or that will be ascribed to them, and that they then cannot break free from that. You'll always be, how you're racialized. There's no moving or overcoming that. What kind of existence is that? What future does that, promote to our youth who are sitting in classrooms where they're told, you're this race and your ancestors are that, so this is what you are and what you can be because of it. That's very dangerous. And I see a lot of misapplication of pedagogical tools, even tools like I mentioned to you earlier that I've previously used. It's like, no, that's retired now because I see the dangers, when it's being used in a way that's not developmentally appropriate. And and that's not helpful to anyone. I make no bones about it. My work, you asked me about my dissertation around No Child Left Behind. I was really looking at Paulo Freire, and Michael Appelian theory. But truly, the way I embodied and enacted those philosophies when I taught, you can go back and ask my former students, they were never, even once, told that they were oppressed or that they were victims. I didn't teach from that way. I taught from human agency and empowerment. And I was using those theories to inform, like kind of my social lens and my theoretical practice, but never did I deliver that direct to students, which is what's being done now that activists have kind of taken over, teacher education, and they're trying to make teachers into activists, and to embrace these frameworks and make pledges and so forth to support this ideology and to do things in their daily work and practice that, again, express fidelity with the neo-reconstructionist ideology in particular. Yeah. It's quite problematic. And again, folks need to think of what's developmentally appropriate and what's pedagogically appropriate, because some of the things that are in tools that are being used with like first and second graders and young people just truly are not appropriate, and they're actually quite dangerous to the human spirit, the developing human spirit.
Yeah, I am pretty skeptical and critical of the sort of, I guess, messaging. We talk about activists and the sort of reconstructionist sort of mindset, but there are also activists sort of in the anti-woke quote unquote space, and like a Chris Rufo or those kinds who are spreading this word that essentially CRT, critical race theory, has infected all of our schools and it's everywhere and blah blah blah. And I have, to your point, and I know you have, seen evidence of that happening. My assertion is that you're certainly going to see it, and I have experienced it. You certainly, in being in California, have experienced it in those kinds of locations, but I'm in Kentucky, and you're not likely to see much evidence, if any, of this kind of thing, especially in practice in sort of rural Kentucky. You might see some things that you could reasonably say are sort of downstream of Paulo Freire and those kinds of things, but you very likely in a place like rural Kentucky might see something similar in dynamic, but around sort of Christian proselytizing and evangelistic kind of things. But I guess one of the pushbacks I'm assuming you've had and heard here is one of the things that you say, well, if we do away with this sort of concept of race as even a habit of mind or something we even think about or even use, we run the risk of sort of the loss of sort of black culture or something like that, right? That there are things that that are important to carry forward. And I it resonates with me in some sense, right? There are some things culturally that we associate with certain, for lack of a better term, race, and I think it's inaccurate, right? But there's some correlation there, right? So when we think about this sort of skeptical eliminativism, how should we think about, or maybe what are the important questions to think about in terms of doing that and not losing some of the things that are in fact valuable that may or may not be attributed accurately?
I think what you just said, that last part of it, that's what was the hook for me. Beginning to interrogate racialization would be a first step, right? We can't just tomorrow say to so many people who have held on to and had this idea of race ingrained into them, for many years, and embrace it and, talk about it. That's one of the challenges of this more generative way of thinking, an emergent way of thinking. And I don't think that, Dr. Mason actually came to one of the schools where I was, where I teach at, one of the community colleges. And that was the first question that people asked. They said, wow, you're attacking, intersectionality. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that it doesn't matter, all of that work that was done and so forth, and that people can't be intersectional. And she said, no, not at all. I'm just saying, let's take the race category out of that concept of intersectionality. And they were like, well, then what will we do? So there's a lot of fear. And that was actually said, like, what would we do if race was gone? Like, how would we even have intersectionality anymore? It's like she expanded, there's like social class, economic class, education level. There's so many other things, that could be looked at and that are more relevant. So I think interrogating the relevance is key for folks and starting to better understand. And that's why I love Carlos Hoyt's work. What is racialization? How does it operate and how does it work? And why is it important for us as educators to understand that? Because if you're working from that neo-reconstructionist lens, it's a statement that everyone is always going to be a victim or an oppressor. And so the alternative under skeptical eliminativism and even some forms of constructionism like constructivist eliminativism is that these things can be overcome. And you have agency as a human being to make changes in your life and in your trajectory. You're not stuck in one way of being and learning and understanding, and it's like a caste system almost that's being proposed by neo-reconstructionists. And so that's something that I think is key for us to start doing, is to interrogate it. What does it mean when we're talking about racialization? How has different understandings of racialization impacted our history and the things that have happened in our past and the social movements and so forth. So it's not saying like don't teach about the past and what race did and didn't do and how it functioned in society, but to teach that from multiple lenses, if you will, or a different lens than the one that's currently dominating, so that we have a better understanding of it and so that we can move forward to these different possibilities that can exist, once we are able to accept one another as equal human beings. One big problem that I personally have with neo-reconstructionism is this idea of them attempting to separate equality from equity. And they talk, they're specialists that come in. I've been in so many workshops and seen them talk. They say that they're separate and that equality's from the past and we're talking about equity now. And then you ask them what is equity and they can never really fully explain it. And they put up pictures of like apples dropping from a tree, or people standing on boxes, and they say that's equity. It still makes no sense to me what I should do with that as a teacher in my classroom, and it speaks nothing at all to things like differentiated instruction, and the fact that we now want to attack merit under that lens. And say that doesn't matter anymore. And let's go ahead and destroy gifted education, which, from my background, I have a big problem with that, and so all of these things are being done under saying that it's for equity. But I want people to get really clear about what they mean. And if we're talking about we're going to dismantle everything and destroy everything, what happens after the dismantling and destruction? I haven't heard that from folks yet. I really need to know because the decisions we make under these banners are going to have ramifications and implications for us long into the future as a society. And I think that folks are starting to wake up now and go like, hey, and question that. A lot of things are getting politicized, which is unfortunate because teaching is a craft and what happens in that realm should be led by, teachers who are, working under the scholarship of teaching and learning, if you will, an inquiry about their context. So to put it in the hands of DEI specialists or even politicians and lawmakers and policymakers is deeply problematic because they don't have the training of developmental appropriateness and other things that we hopefully are still getting in our teacher ed programs. And B, it's just it's like to me, it's a deprofessionalization of teachers. It's someone coming in again, like they did under No Child Left Behind, and saying, here's a prescription, here's what you need to do, follow it without deviation, and we're going to standardize everything out and have standardized lives and people too. Like that's problematic for me.
Right. Well, I mean, the word absolutist and absolutism is, I think, important here, and you mentioned that in the piece. You know, it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's more what we should be after and making sure of is not that these neo-reconstructionists like Kendi or D'Angelo or anything downstream of that or horizontal to that or whatever are silenced, right? Because we don't need to, it's not something that's not a reasonable or smart or sort of democratic goal, right? Like, we want to make sure that they are still allowed to have their voice, but not be the only voice, and not be the voice that says, if you don't agree, then you are in trouble, we're going to call you names, we're going to sue you, fire you, cancel you, whatever, right? So, I mean, I think that's just a point that I don't know if many educators really are aware of the extent to which, and again, I'm sort of skeptical and a little cynical on sort of the Chris Rufo claims that this is happening everywhere and all the time, right? But it does happen, and it is happening, and you can speak to that personally. So, you know, this might be a good time to talk about that as you have outlined some of that in this piece as well.
Yes. And that is deeply concerning to me because, again, as I started to explore this, Drew, and to then share my work with other teachers, I found that in certain spheres and spaces, because of the leadership that's kind of just been, I would say, that like a coup happened. I don't know what happened, but it's like academic freedom's out the door, freedom of expression's out the door. We're promoting racial equity. What does that mean? We can't tell you, but things have to change, and everything has to be dismantled. And I saw that, you know, some of my colleagues, you know, they were afraid to say anything different, and they didn't have language to like express the discomfort that they had. And so that was really the inspiration for this article and the workshops that I've been doing around the topic. Because people need to be able to name is powerful, right? To understand, like, this is what's being stated here, even though the folks aren't saying it directly. Mm-hmm. And so I really, you know, wanted to get the language out to people. And two, not everyone is working under a neo-reconstructionist lens, even if that's what's being pushed through their policies at the schools. This has like ran through educational policy at lightning speed that I've never seen. Usually in education, we say like things move slowly. It's going to take years to affect change. It's like something, the social things that happen, not something, but the social things that happen really made these conditions where like it was hyper speed adoption of things. And unfortunately, no one pumped the brakes and said, hey, and asked questions like we're supposed to, critical thinking being one of the primary missions of California community colleges.
Right.
And so, you know, in high leadership spaces and policy and so forth, things got rammed through. And then folks like me, who are, I guess, Renaissance people, educators, were like, well, hey, you know, is there another way to do this? And we didn't know what it was yet, right? Myself personally. Like, or hey, you know, what are we meaning when we say equity? Those of us who would ask simple questions, just questions like, what does this mean? Where could this end up? You know, if we change the governance structures to put in racialized affinity groups, you know, how does that work? Are they really representative of the whole campus? Which I know they're not, you know, because not everyone joins those groups, because not everyone identifies that way, you know, even if they're racialized a certain way. And different groups have different political and social leanings, if you will, even on a campus. So it was hard for me when I began to, you know, share these different ways of thinking, and people who identified themselves as, they didn't say neo-reconstructionists, but they would say third wave anti-racist, or a Kendi supporter, a D'Angelo supporter, if you will. They started to attack me, and they started to say, you can't talk about these things. Like, how dare you say that there's more than one way to do equity work. There's only one way. And I would say, well, what's the one way? And they would just say, this is the book and here,
do the work.
We do the work. We've all read it and we're all aligned. And then as I started to talk to people individually, I saw that we weren't all aligned, and that some of us did have more questions that we wanted to ask. But the environment was such that if you just asked a question, your job could literally become at risk. Friendships that you had held with people for decades, and years could suddenly be cut off.
Right.
And that's because that lens really has an absolutist and totalitarian vein of it. And you're not allowed to question. You're not allowed to say there's more than one way. If you ask a critical question, or even pretend, seem to be that you're questioning it, or the relevance of it, or is this really good for students? You become labeled a racist, because that is what it says. You're either with us or against us.
Right.
And so it's kind of like the far left has become really like the far right. Like they're looking more and more like each other every day to me.
Right.
I would
agree.
And it's like what's happening here? Like you all are saying the same things to me, like with us or against us. Shut it down if we don't agree. I mean, it's happening on both ends of the extremes. And then there's the rest of us who are just kind of stuck in the middle and going like, oh my gosh, I don't want that, the left to get me, and I don't want the right to get me. Like they're both scary, and I just want to be a great teacher, so I just close my classroom door and I try not to interact with any of it. But then some folks will say there's no neutral ground, right? So if you're just closing your door, then you're on the side of racism too.
Right.
It's
Silence is complicity.
Yeah. So it's like we're literally stuck in the middle. And the things that have happened to me, I just didn't know the extent that people would go to, in the neo-reconstructionist camp. I've received veiled threats and direct threats from people, saying that I'm, inhibiting equity progress. That won't be tolerated. My job has been called for. My head has been called for. People, saying that don't teach about these multiple ways. We don't want to hear it. It doesn't belong here. As I went into teach, so something I've always done, I worked when I was in middle school with the universal theme of conflict with my gifted students. And this was the early 90s and, a long time ago now, but I was always teaching about, difficult concepts and topics. And that's just been like a passion for me.
Difficult as in like maybe uncomfortable, that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. And challenging, challenging things, like my students, when HR 4437 was coming through, attacking immigrants in our, through the legislature, my students were very concerned about that, because some of their relatives and, family members were going to be directly impacted and maybe deported suddenly, Right. So it's something that I've always worked with, but, as I see what's happening now in the sphere and how we're literally stamping out critical thinking, we can only work with the difficult topics that are prescribed to us, and that align with the ideology. It concerns me, I had pushback around using these terms, these made up terms of racialization. They're all made up, but these are like neo made up racialization terms, like Latinx. And now they're trying to do Philippine X and so forth. And I'm someone who, I have my background, I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, was working with teachers of English and speakers of other languages, teaching English to speakers of other languages. And I've always taught to have great pride and see the beauty of the home language of the students and to have respect for it. And so when I saw these terms being pushed through the California community college space, I said, what is that? What is that coming from? It's not part of the state of California dashboard, those strange terms with X's at the end and so forth. And I said, and I've worked, for 10 years, decades here in, Spanish speaking communities. I've never heard anyone use that term. Grew up in the Central Valley, which has the largest population of Filipino people. I've never heard anyone say I'm Filipinx or Filipinx or however you pronounce it, And I said, wow, what is this in actuality? And I would ask people, where did this come from? When did we start using it? No one could tell me. Just one day, it was decided we would all begin using these terms uncritically without knowing where it came from.
Right. That's what a decent person does, right?
Right. And I'm like, hey, I can't just uncritically do that. And especially with the history that I know. And I would go back and ask people have you heard this? And they're like, no, what is that? Know? And so for people to just self-righteously redeem whole groups of people wholesale. And then I was attacked for not being quote gender inclusive, for not using that. And I said, no, what you're doing is actually linguistic imperialism. You're taking a language and putting English social norms onto that beautiful language so that English speakers feel better about their gender ideologies that they're trying to advance. That got me into huge trouble. That got me into big trouble just for questioning that. Why are we suddenly uppercasing Black and lowercasing white in our official school documents and so forth?
Yeah.
Questions like that. Our land acknowledgements, I don't know if they do that, but I was one of the early proponents of land acknowledgements before it was being done everywhere. Now it's like a mandate that you must do it. Again, it signals ideological fidelity. That's all it is empty ideological signaling. Because when I started to interrogate, I was at a school where they were recognizing the wrong tribe as indigenous to the lands. And I pointed it out and said, hey, there's a tribe that's actually saying this area is ours and they have the history and so forth. Why are we saying it's another tribal nation, right? It didn't matter. It didn't matter that it was the wrong tribe. It matters that you engage in the ideological fidelity, the exercise of doing it and of uplifting oppressed peoples, even if it's the wrong group of oppressed peoples, it's okay because that's what we're doing at this moment. And I pointed out too, what's a land acknowledgement, right? That doesn't make substantial changes or promise to make substantial changes in real time for the lives of tribal people of tribal nations. What is the point of acknowledging something was stolen? What are you doing about it? What will you do? So if you have a land acknowledgement that says none of that and is talking about the wrong tribe, then to me, that's disingenuous. And all of these, now there's all sorts of acknowledgements we need to do at the start of a meeting. I don't participate in any of them because I see that it is aligned with this same absolutist ideology. It has all of these practices that go along with it that we all must do or be ostracized. Because we're not doing them. And what about freedom of expression just the freedom to participate or not participate in something? When things become mandated, Drew, that's when I start to have an issue with it because I believe in the freedom of every individual and I believe in human agency. And I think that those are precious things. I think that America, it is a great experiment. That is how I've always taught it through my civics classes that I teach. And it's a wonderful experiment. It's flawed. Everything involving human beings, right, is beautifully flawed. And there's nothing wrong with talking about what those flaws were, with learning the historical facts, around them. But when we start to infuse these ideologies and misrepresent and recast history, then I have a problem. When we're redefining what racism means, we're defining America in a certain way and saying it needs to be destroyed and dismantled. I have a big problem with that. And I think that having the experience of going to other countries and post-Soviet nations and so forth, and doing volunteer teaching in those spaces really helped me to get a better appreciation for the freedoms that we do have and for the experiment that we are involved in and wanting to continue that, not destroy it.
Well, one of the, things that I am really trying to figure out, and I'm really curious to hear your perception of it. Again, this idea that this sort of wokeism, and I do think it's maybe useful to sort of distinguish between, I had this interaction on Twitter with with somebody, and he was using the term classic woke versus new woke, and I thought that was a really useful distinction, right? Sort of classic woke would be aligned with Martin Luther King Jr. kind of sentiment, right? And that is more consistent with sort of Enlightenment values and inquiry and that kind of thing. And new woke, which is what we see in sort of anti-racist education, the neo-reconstructionist, the Kendi, the D'Angelo, again, on down, is sort of more authoritarian, saying these are the rules and you must play by them, and if you don't play by them, you are a bad person. And again, we do see some examples of that. It looks a little different on the right, depending on which parties you're looking at on the right, but I would say Trump and MAGA sort of mindset is we're looking for heretics, right? If you're not with us, you are a rhino. You are against us. And we see some of these infringements on the First Amendment by DeSantis in Florida. We see some of that sort of authoritarian streak in legislation here in Kentucky. We see some of it, and I've had conversations with legislators and educational leaders about it, and those are real concerns of mine as well. People who I interact with on the left will often say, when I share with them examples like the gentleman, I think, is it Tyrone Howard, the guy who wrote the piece about being an anti-racist educator or hell or something like that.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah, and he's very much a man of the left, right? Like his work is in, I think, what he called it, domination studies of racial domination or something like that, right? So this is not a man of the right by any stretch of the imagination. He was telling this example where he was essentially just railroaded out and run over by students who were sort of in this authoritarian, neo-reconstructionist, new woke kind of mindset. And when I share those examples with people who tend to be more on the left, they say, yeah, that happens. Certainly it does, but it's more fringe, and it's not a problem to the extent of that we see from the right, the sort of Christo-fascist or theo-fascist or whatever you might say, how you want to term that. And I don't know. I honestly am really curious how people see that. I see it as an increasing problem, even though I'm skeptical of the extent of some of the claims. But do you see, how do you see that? If you're making the ledger of the threats from the right and the similar threats from the left, do you see... And again, I don't want to make any sort of moral equivalency here because that's not what I'm trying to do. They're not exactly equal. But how do you see that balance?
So, some folks, Drew, they talk about lived experience and how important that is in today's world, right?
Right.
I can only speak from my lived experience, which... and I don't mean to have that long pause there. I'm trying to carefully. It's a very touchy subject because what I've seen and experienced, at least in the California community college space, right? I'm not talking about all California schools, but this is at multiple California community colleges, is this environment and attitude of, and this is from far left progressives. Mm-hmm. That's how they identify themselves.
Right.
And that's what they call themselves. Some of them even identify as socialists and communists, even though it's illegal to promote communism in the state of California per the Ed Code.
Is that right?
Yes.
Did not know that.
But it's definitely happening in so many spaces. And, it disappoints me because I always thought, and, maybe this is my mistake or my naivete, that in more, quote, progressive spaces, when I think of progressivism, I think of like John Dewey and others. But again, I've been told I better be careful who I cite because I'm citing too many, quote, white authors.
Right.
But it's just, that's what I think of. And I think of free thinking and, and being able to see multiple sides of a picture.
Making sure that we do.
Yes. And that being like a mission of institutions and educators. But that's not what's happening right now. what's happening in that space is this environment of you will, at all points in time and every action that you do, every breath you take, every step you make, you will make sure to express fidelity with neo-reconstructionism, how it not only how it understands race, but how it understands gender. And if you make any one mistake, or you don't put your pronouns out there and signal them to everyone that you can at every moment, which is aligned, because that's this idea that gender is socially constructed, right? It's part of the same philosophy. Some people call it critical social justice.
Right.
If you are not stating support for Palestine, if you in any way support Israel and its right to exist, it's problematic in progressive spaces. I'm not talking about white nationalists or strange things like that. I'm talking about far left places. Those are all things that I've run into trouble about, and you know, it concerns me a great deal, because what we do when we start to tell people you must be this way or that way, the way that I've always approached like diversity and equity and inclusion and so forth, invite everyone, let everyone speak, and let everyone be known. Because what happens when you start to say you must do this or that or be this way or that way, people in their hearts don't align with that, right? And they're not with it at all, but they'll give you the outward signals that they're there. And so what have you done? You've pushed it further underground instead of having things open where you can still have dialogue and exchange and maybe have some chance for transformation, you know, or for moving along the spectrum, whatever, you know, however you imagine things to be, you know, in terms of how humans are. So this environment of literal cancellation, you know, she didn't say, put her pronouns, she didn't, you know, say that she agrees with Kendi 100% and wants that federal anti-racist, you know, branch of the government to be established. You know, she questioned Alicia Garza, the Black Lives Matter founder, so she's disrespectful, you know, all of these kind of ugly things. And then the things that are invented. So you may say something, but things will be invented and ascribed to you that you must also align with because you said X or Y. The lying that people have done, the alignment, the defamation, you know, the assumption, because you said this, now you're aligned with all these other things and you're a crazy right-winger. You know, the labeling, the quick to label and judge and assume. I personally experienced that. And not only that, people have seen what's happened to me. And so they come and confide in me things that have happened to them that they don't want to share with anyone because they want their livelihood. They want to be safe. They have bills to pay. And, you know, it's not just, you know, something that they're doing for fun. I mean, this is a profession, you know, for people. And so to have your whole profession and your professionalism called into question, to be deemed unfit to teach because you're, you know, promoting viewpoint diversity, which is something that I do. I've been literally attacked, maligned, and drugged through the mud and had my family attacked who aren't even doing this work, you know, like that. So it's like, it's
how dare they be related to you? Right.
Yeah. And, you know, they're all racist too, you know? And so it's like, it's something that we have to get a handle on. I know that some people are skeptical and they say like, oh, okay, you know, like the left's really blowing it up or the right's really blowing it up. Well, things are really happening on both sides. And sadly, the anti-Semitism piece, and I will speak on it because it's something I've always taught about. I didn't think it was unusual to teach about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, but apparently in these far left spaces, it's not allowed. It's not welcomed. I worked at an institution where just now in 2022, the first time they recognized Jewish American Heritage Month, for example, for a college that's been in existence for many years. So, you know, there's spaces like that where hostilities are invented and under this neo-reconstructionist lens, which views certain groups of people as oppressors and as not worthy, of elevation. That's where we see these things. And people like me who are saying like, hey, there's an issue here and look at the statistics and let's have some community education around that. We're literally shut out, ostracized, and shut up, and have our jobs threatened by people who say we're actually, I think the statement was made, she's elevating the wrong things, and not promoting our perspective with fidelity. And if I had ever known that was an expectation upon me to speak someone else's viewpoint with fidelity and not just my own individual scholarship and work, I would have probably not been in certain spaces if I had known that. So it's, like the things you learn in hindsight, right? Wow. If that was the expectation, I definitely would have not stepped into that space in particular,
Right.
And it's dangerous because the consequences are very real. When we talk about, a teacher being ostracized from their peers, having their livelihood potentially taken away just for simply looking at different ways of viewing a topic like race or gender or any other topic.
Right.
To me, that's what teaching is supposed to be all about. So where's the mission of teaching anymore?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to make clear that there are people who perhaps are not neo-reconstructionists in terms of race, but might display some of these same kinds of behaviors, maybe around gender ideology. You must accept the sort of company line on trans rights and allowing kids to transition or blah blah blah, and some of those folks might be more aligned with the skeptical eliminativism. So it is a sort of mindset, and again we see a fair amount of it on the right. This sort of authoritarian, like my way or the highway. We're looking for these binaries. We're looking for heretics. We're looking for witches. We're looking for rhinos or whatever the case may be. But in terms, sort of wrapping us up and thinking about, really focusing in on the race ideologies, maybe I'm going to give you an opportunity to sort of sum that up. Like, really, what do you want the education space and folks in it to really take away from your article in this conversation?
The big takeaway for me is for us as educators to take an inquiry-based approach to race ideologies in particular. When terms are used in your trainings, in your policies, in your discussions with colleagues, like race, racism, and race and racism and racial equity, what do those things mean? What philosophies are they rooted in? When folks are telling you, because of these definitions of race and racism and racial equity, we must now do these practices, which philosophies, again, are those practices rooted in? And does it square with you and your knowledge and experience? And if it does, recognizing that it won't square with everyone, because there are these multiple ways of viewing race, racism, and racial equity that exist. Some of us are in environments where we're being told there's one way and don't ask any questions about it. Mm-hmm. Whenever you're in an environment, I would just encourage anyone where someone says you can't ask questions or you need to get into a segregated group by race and then ask your questions. That's problematic. That flies against like everything that we've known as educators of working from at least a humanistic perspective. So how are we dividing people or unifying people? And what's the end game of whatever philosophy is being pushed? I hope that just being able to name, what this person's saying is naturalist in this moment. It's a neo-reconstructionist perspective. This is now skeptical eliminativism. Like just being able to navigate that in my own internal dialogue as an educator has been so powerful, because I've been in so many spaces, Drew, right now where things are just presented as fact, as the way it is. And there's many ways to see something and to view it. and just reopening ourselves to that. So that we can be our most authentic selves and ask our hard, difficult questions together, and explore topics together and identify, even if we may view race differently, what are some of our commonalities? How can we best support our students, together? Because we can't just all work separately and do it in a different way and not communicate with each other. And students are getting all these different, like, confusing messages about the reality and the world and so forth. And they're not being able to name it themselves. So that's why I've really been working with students, even sharing the race ideologies with them. So when they sit in a classroom and their teacher presents things, they can know for themselves, like, okay, this person's coming from this perspective. As a student, how do I interact with that? And especially because some people in certain philosophies, they grade students based on whether they parrot back to them what's been said. And that's unfortunate and it shouldn't be happening, but I hear the stories over and over again. I'm afraid to write this in my essay. That teacher will tear me apart because they say, racism is everywhere and will never be gone, so just having that awareness of who we are, what our different philosophies are, and then being able to build those bridges. We have to know what we're dealing with before we can build the bridges to move ahead. Right. And so that's what my hope is that this piece will do and that my work will do, is to help give us language to build those bridges, to have better understanding and better acceptance of every person, where no one's silenced. Some of the ideas, I sit in workshops and I'm like, I feel physically ill from that. But I sit. You know why? Because there's something I can take away from that and that I can grow and learn from. And so I want us to all just have that openness again, to be able to encounter diverse and divergent ideas, and to explore them, to take what's good for me and what's not. And maybe later on, I circle back 10 years later and wow, I pick up something again. That's the beauty of teaching and learning to me. And I want us to rediscover that and the joy of that together. And that's what I hope this piece will do.
Well, certainly a wonderful pursuit and one that I would agree with as well. The piece is Race, Ideology, and Practice. We'll put it in the show notes. If you're on Apple Podcasts, you can click the link to view the links and it'll take you to our website where you'll see it. But if you just go to freeblackthought.substack.com, you can find it there from February 28th if you're listening to this at some later date. And speaking of links and things like that, any other things and places where you would like for folks to find you or to view your work or anything like that?
Yes, at the end of the article, I do link to my Race Ideologies resources. And so, just click through that link. There's some interactive activities for students and for, teachers as well. And my contact info is there as well. So, connect up with me and let's continue the dialogue.
Right. And that is a tiny URL. We'll put that in the show notes as well. But as she said, it's in the near the end of the Substack piece. So, well, Lee, as I said, what you're talking about is certainly resonant with the way that I think and some of my concerns. And we have to get to a better place. I think, this sort of idea of advocating for liberal science and being able to question and leave open the opportunity to have different opinions. And if we don't have that, then that to me is one of those foundational pillars of our democracy. And to me, that is a scary thing to see that go away. So I could not agree more. So as I always say, hopefully this conversation was helpful to folks, and it was a pleasure talking.
Thank you.
Thanks again so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you found this conversation to be useful, thought-provoking, or something that's worth commenting on and sharing, please do so with your friends, your social networks, and leave reviews where you listen to your podcasts. It's really helpful for our podcast and hopefully for anybody that you might share with. And of course, please visit us at wegrowteachers.com if you have questions about our professional development, or email me at drew@teachthought.com.